Hello everybody. We have a Road to 2100 game that we played, a 15-10 minute game against Sakovsky, rated 1900 from India. We played him before. It said that we were one win, one loss against this guy before we started this game. So he's beaten us, we've beaten him. He might be in the speed run somewhere. I have no idea what episode. You could try to figure that one out. But anyway, let's go through the game. I open up with 1e4 as usual, and he decides to play the Sicilian. So we seize the center, and he attacks the center. We develop a knight to c3. This gets a piece out, controls the center. Black goes d6, standard Sicilian move. This controls the center and opens up a diagonal for his piece. I develop my bishop, which prepares castling with tempo because it gives a check. So he has to respond to it. You can only block it with the bishop or the knight. He decides to block it with the bishop. Here you have different ways of playing. You could probably take. Maybe you could support it with a4 even. You could even drop it back, I imagine. But I just want to keep developing and moving forward. So I just play d3. This supports the center and it opens up a diagonal for my bishop. Black goes knight c6. This develops a piece. Also helps the tension a little between the bishops and defends the center. You guys should know my next move, right? I always make it. What is it? F4. There we go. F4 on the board. Black goes, well, first F4. It attacks the center, so his pieces can't use the square. It also is another attacking piece to play F5 in the future and break this down. And it gives more space to the rook and the bishop once his pawn is traded or moves. So black goes g6. This does not attack the center, but it prepares to fianchetto the bishop. So we just develop our knight towards the center, the most logical, natural move in the position. Hitting the center, preparing castling. Black plays the most natural response, fianchettoing his bishop, controlling the center. Now the most natural move here is definitely castling. I don't know why I didn't castle, I must have been in a mood, but instead I played bishop d2, which is another perfectly fine move. But this knight doesn't need support. Like if he takes and you take with the pawn, that's a really good doubled pawn because it stops the knight. It supports the center, gives you the b file, and he gave up the bishop he needs to cover these squares. So him taking is not a threat. But it's also fine if you do put your bishop here. It's not a big deal. So he just develops his knight, developing a piece, hitting the center, preparing castling. And now we castle. Makes perfect sense. Our rook has a little scope. Our king, we're getting it safer. Fine. Black castles. King safety taken care of. And you can see that a 1900 plays developing moves, king safety moves, and center, right? And I've done the same. So now I go, you're in this position as white and you're like, okay, what to do? I still need to develop. I can't exactly push yet. So I go queen e1. It's kind of like in the Grand Prix attack, you can't even talk. You swing your queen over to e1 with the idea of like let's say a queen h5, bishop h6, knight 8, knight g5 ideas. Anyway, you shift your queen over, or I shifted mine. And now black makes this move a6. And it doesn't look like a big deal because how could it be bad? But it will actually lose him the game. And that's why you should be careful when making these pawn moves, as I've mentioned many times. Once he moves this pawn, it creates serious weaknesses on the dark squares. But we'll see. So anyway, he's threatening our bishop. If we go back, we're going to get it trapped or something. So we just take a forcing move. We get rid of a piece. He takes a piece back. And now we get the turn back. And the position's equal. You know, we both have nice stuff going on. So we just have to continue the position. So like I mentioned, you could go queen h4 here with the previous ideas. But I decided to choose the second option, way of attacking. And that's by playing f5 immediately. Trying to open up this construction towards his king. And giving my pieces more space. And you could always play queen h4 next. Black responds with queen b6. Countering on this side of the board. And threatening this check. Discovery. So we have to be careful on how we respond. Because he's going to push c4 at some point. We want to make sure it doesn't hurt us. So I threw in f takes g. It's not necessary. Like the move you're going to play here at some point is rook b1 to defend this pawn. I just threw in f takes g because I figured he can't take my pawn as an intermezzo because then I could take with check. So he's probably going to take back my g pawn and then I can play rook b1 after that. Although keeping the tension is probably better because it leaves more options for the game. And if you take and he chooses to take with the f pawn, that does open up his f rook, which is less than ideal. So it's better to keep the tension and just leave it like this. And just play rook b1 first. I take first, not a big deal, very little difference. He recaptures the natural way, which is with the h pawn. This actually makes my f takes g a lot better, because now when he takes back and I throw in rook b1, he gained nothing from that, whereas my rook is a little more open. If he took with the f pawn, he would have gained an open rook to contest my open rook. So by taking back the natural way, which is how most people would probably recapture, it makes my move even better. I go rook b1 because you don't want to get him to get in here. I calculated a lot of stuff like, oh, he takes and you go in, you know, he's here, he's almost trapped, blah, blah, blah. But anytime he takes this, he always has the c2 pawn, and it's the c2 pawn that ruins everything. If the c2 pawn was defended already, you had some cool stuff, but that's not the case. So you don't want him to take. So, you know, b3, rook b1, whatever. Rook b1 defends the pawn and gets it out of this alignment with the bishop. So black decides to give this check while attacking my structure. And I think that I made two mistakes in this game. One was easy to see and one was not so easy to see. And this is my first one. I mean, it's not a mistake according to the computer really, but it is to me, and so is the other one. Oh, it is a mistake to the computer, but I mean, the computer says it's fine or whatever, but the thing is, you know when you make a move and then as soon as you make it, you're like, you see like your opponent's response, but you only see it the second you make the move and not before. So that's what happened here. At first, I was gonna just go bishop e3 and say, oh, you know, it's a good blocking move, improves my bishop. He has to respond with the queen, and then I could do whatever I want with this pawn. And I was gonna do that, and I'm like, oh, king h1 looks good too, no big deal. And then I'm like, oh, wait, maybe I have d4, and if I have d4, that would be super amazing. This pawn is hit twice, but it's defended twice. This d4 pawn is protected by the knight. And as soon as I made this move, I was like, oh wait, what about e5? Because I just wasn't looking at that direction, because normally you don't push e5 because it's positionally so bad to make the backward d pawn. And as soon as this, I'm like, I started panicking in my head. I'm like, wait, e5, what do I do e5? So I start calculating like crazy to see how I can respond to this. And the problem I thought this move came with was it attacks the pawn twice, and it's only defended once. And if you want to defend it again, you have to either put your bishop here, your knight here, or your queen here. And in all three of those cases, this queen loses contact with this pawn, which means that would be hanging. So I settled on in my head, okay, e5, bishop e3. Now it's defended twice. He can't take this pawn, and if he takes this pawn, he's always going to run into some type of like d5 discovery issue. So I thought that tactically it would work, but I was still worried. I was like, oh my god, I don't know how good this is, if it works for real, because it's hard to, I guess, consider all the repercussions after that. But he didn't do it, and he goes queen a5, and I'm like, oh man. I wasn't so happy because I was happy because he didn't play a5. So the second he did anything other than that, I was like, oh my god, thank god. Whew. And then I looked at what he did, and I'm like, queen a5. This looks really weird because he's going directly into my knight. I mean, into my bishop. So that's like the weirdest move on earth. And so I was trying to figure out why he did it. I'm like, what's the threat? I mean, okay, he's pressuring the pawn on a2. Maybe he wants to swing over to the king side. I'm not really sure. But I'm like, let me see if I can take advantage of this, because it's here. So I started looking at knight jumps, and then I said, okay, what happens if I go to any of the squares? And I settled on knight d5, which I calculated beforehand, hits the queen, and also attacks the pawn with check. The only way to defend both would be to go back home, so your queen doesn't hang. So that's what he did, but I had calculated that, I'm like, okay, he's going to go back home, but what's my follow-up move? Do I have a good move? And you have to do this in the game, or you can't just throw your knight in willy-nilly. So then I found the next move, which continues the game-winning sequence. What do you think it is? Some of you are wrong. Some of you are right. Bishop a5, utilizing the weak dark squares. Now, if this pawn was back on a7, he could just play b6. No problem, but that's not the case. He created these weaknesses, and this is why it's so important not to push pawns unnecessarily. Because now his queen's hit, but his queen wants to stay in contact with the pawn. But if it goes here, it gets forked. If it goes here, it gets forked. If it goes here, it gets forked. If it goes here, I mean, I don't know why it's there, it just loses the stuff. So he has to pick one of the squares here, but that allows me to jump in with the fork. And so the game is effectively over the second he goes queen to a5. But we play on. So what does he do? He says, you know what? I'm going to lose an exchange. Let me try to get as active as possible. He brings his queen here, and this is actually somewhat scary in the sense that these three pieces are coordinating on my e4 point, and if he can take these central pawns, or even one of them, that would be really good for him. You know, some type of compensation. You know, if his knight's here, it's also close to my king. His bishop's staring at my knight. This bishop also has pressure down the diagonal toward the center. He could have some compensation. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, so if I take the rook, you know, and he jumps some stuff in here, I lose my center right away. Maybe that's not the best approach. I decided to throw in an intermezzo move, d5. I figured, at the very least, let me throw this in. It will cut off the bishop's pressure on e4. I mean, it's still hanging, but at least it's one less piece pressuring my position. Because his bishop was also pressuring the knight behind it and my king behind that. So just get it off the diagonal, right? So he moves. And again, now I could take the rook. I considered a4 to see if I could do something. Is the bishop trapped? Does it have to go back? If it had to do any of that, maybe. But if you play a4 and he goes bishop d7, I mean, you can't really do that if you plan on taking the rook, because then your pawn will hang. That's why I didn't do it. So I just take the rook. Now the computer wants you to play this whole position as white in just a positional domination style. So basically, you leave the knight here. You don't even take the rook at any point. You let him go wherever he wants, because no rook can ever come to the c. I mean, this is my guess. The engine doesn't talk, but I'm guessing because the no rook can ever come to the c file anyway, and so the rooks don't have anywhere to play, right? So it doesn't matter if he if he has his rooks or not. They can't do anything. This square is super weak. This square is covered, and this knight will dominate. So the computer says don't even take. I'm not a computer. I'm definitely gonna take, because this is winning to me. And he could take back right away, or he could try to be a little fancy and throw in the move c3, which hits the rook and still hits the knight, right? And opens up the bishop. It looks like, you know, threatens this pawn with some backup behind it. It looks like a good intermezzo move to include. And like, what's the downside? Because if, let's say, he pushes, he's hitting my rook. I can't throw a piece in the middle if I don't want to lose my rook, and I go up, right? And then he jumps in, takes my pawn, hitting my rook. My rook is actually trapped. Can't go anywhere. And I lost my central pawn, and he's going to get the knight. And that's why active pieces are so strong. And he would have plenty of compensation. So he goes c3, and I'm like, what the heck? If I move my rook, he is going to take my bishop, my knight, my center. He's going to have compensation. And so I made a brilliant move here, the only brilliant move of the game as white. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to try to find it. I kind of gave like a thought process to lead you at least to the conclusion it's not a rook move. Okay, so I figured, yeah, I'm up in exchange, but if I go here, I'm going to lose the exchange back and my center. None of that makes any sense. Well, let me just move my knight. Brilliant. And hang my rook. How does that make sense? Well, I took his rook. So if he takes my rook and I take his bishop, I'm just up a piece. Okay, he'll take my center pawn. It'll be a minor piece for a pawn, but this knight will still be here in its dominating position. And I'll be up basically a piece, which is better than an exchange. So that's what I do. He takes my rook. I take back his bishop. Now I am just up a clean bishop. This pawn is hanging, however, and there's this whole thing happening, but let's see. So what does black do? He takes the pawn in the center. Now he has a pawn for the piece. And he's creating some threats, some coordination squares, yada yada yada. This pawn is kind of annoying. You can't let him take with the bishop supporting it. We have to get rid of this pawn. So we take the pawn, we bring our bishop back into the game, supporting the center, challenging his long diagonal. Fine. We don't really have a choice. You have to do it. You couldn't let that c3 pawn live with the support of these pieces. Fine. But now our bishop's just hanging in limbo, and his knight's right here. So he's probably going to take and double our pawns. That's what he does. So he takes our piece. We don't have a choice. We have to take back. Fine. Now we have these doubled pawns. This guy's weak. He's probably going to take it, right? He takes it. Okay. So after all is said and done, it's still the same. We have two minor pieces, so we're up a minor piece for a central pawn. And this knight is very powerful because the move black wants to make to harmonize his position is rook c8. But he can't do that. So that's a big problem for him. Also, the b file is open. His b7 pawn is backwards and weak. Not looking too good for him. Fine. But what do I do from here? Well, I'm up a lot of stuff. I'm up a piece. This bishop is good, though. It has a lot of pressure on the dark squares. If I could trade a bishop for a knight, that would be glorious. But if I could trade basically anything, that should be good for me because I'm up a piece. So at first, the move I want to make, and probably the better move, is queen d3. Centralizing the queen, attacking the bishop, seeing what happens. But I said, you know what, I only have 4 minutes. Let me just throw this into an endgame by force. So I decided to go queen c4. This attacks the queen and the bishop. He can't move the queen to a place that defends the bishop, so in order not to lose the bishop, he has to queen trade. And before I did this, I had to have seen or considered rook c8 because that looked a little strong. Going down the c file, hitting my knight, x-raying the pawn. But then I said if he goes here, I guess I have knight e3, defending the pawn. He can't attack that knight with the bishop because the other knight defends. So I think I should be fine. And once I move my knight, this is also hanging, so whatever. He played b5, which I didn't consider because rook c8 was just so natural to me. I thought that's what he would do. In any case, I moved my knight here. He went b5 because the pawn was hanging, so he wanted to protect it, and oops. He wanted to protect the pawn and then play rook c8, which makes sense. Here I wanted to do something like rook b3, get active on the third rank, but I figured after b4, a3, a5, takes, I would just have to move the rook back or something, or get my knight involved, but that looked weird. So I was like, okay, what's the plan here as white? How do I make progress? And then I said, okay, I have a pawn here. I would love to have a knight here. This guy, that looks like a plan. Also, king f2 looks like an improving move. Rook d1 or e1. So I put my rook here. Why? Well, I can't jump my knight in here because his bishop's there. So I'm defending the square, the center. And if we look at the center, I have a pawn and a nice piece control. His bishop does eye it though, but I did say before it's a good bishop. So he just drops back. He says, okay, I need the rook to pressure the c-file. The bishop's in the way. Let me just go back. And this would be my second mistake, a much different mistake. Like the first one was when I allowed e5, which is still playable, but not what you want when you have a better position to ruin it. And then this, I allowed, I guess, a particular move that I didn't notice. So again, my idea is to go here and here. And now if I go here and he trades, I don't care because this pawn's defended and he's trading his only good, a good bishop for one of my knights. I'm up a piece, whatever. So I jump my knight in. Now the only thing this allows, which my opponent didn't find, is rook to c3, attacking my knight, which I thought was no problem because king f2. But then it allows a rook a3, and then you have to, play actively to counterbalance the fact he's going to eventually win that pawn. And then if you're down too many pawns, even though you're up a piece, you can't checkmate him. So it's like, you shouldn't have allowed this. It's better to just, let's say, bring the king in first, and then, maybe rook up and then do it. One of those, something like that. Just play it a little slower. But whatever, I did it. I jumped it in, and he made it what to me looks maybe even more natural, and that's bishop here, because he doesn't want to trade it off, and this is hanging, so it looks kind of natural. Of course, this is going to obviously be responded to with the king move, which is what I did. Fine. And now black goes here, attacking this pawn, and it looks like no big deal, but then I'm like, oh man, this is really annoying because it attacks the pawn, which is defended by the knight. But he could just take the knight at any point and then just take the pawn. I'm like, okay, I have a rook defending it. I could just move my knight, right? But if I move this knight, let's say wherever, he could again take this knight with check. I want to take this pawn, which nothing's defending anymore. So then I'm like, wait, no matter what I do, I'm either going to hang this pawn or this pawn after he takes this at some point. I'm like, that's annoying. But then I said, oh wait, I found the response that, tactically deals with everything. And that's rook d2. And so, yes, this knight is pinned, kind of, but he can't take. Like, he gets a pawn, you get a rook. He gets a rook, you get a pawn with check. So he didn't get anything from it. And you're up a piece to trade. He doesn't want to just trade stuff. And if he takes here first, which he did, you have to take back. And now this pawn's hanging, so he took it. So here I'm like, okay, he gets the pawn, and I calculated this before rook d2, that I had all this, and my next move, because otherwise you don't know if rook d2 works. And so I said, okay, I gotta somehow get out of this, make my knight active. What's the best knight jump? And I'm like, okay, this one threatens a pawn with check, so it can't be bad. And then when I was looking at this for like a split second in my head, the instant I looked at this and got excited, I'm like, oh no, he has the check. And I thought I couldn't do it, which doesn't make any sense because your knight's here and your knight can take. But for some reason I thought he can get out with a check and defend the pawn, and I'm like, oh. But then I realized I was tripping, because like I said, it's only like a split second thing, and then the next millisecond your mind's like, oh, I can do that move. It all happened so fast in the head. And then as soon as I played this, he like instantaneously did the move that I blundered into in my head, you know, in a split second, this one. And then I instantly took it, and he resigned. So it was a long, hard-fought game, but not really. It was just like a standard Sicilian. I would say this move's unnecessary. You could just castle first. The bishop's already kind of developed here once you play as 5. I would leave the tension. There's no downside. If he ever takes, that's always good for you. And then here, just don't blunder e5. Obviously, just play bishop e3. Or even king h1 I like, to get it off the diagonal. And you're fine. Never walk into a discovery like this. That's insane. And if you do, you absolutely have to calculate all the knight jumps. This is extremely obvious, so I'm not sure what this move is. From a 1900, that's no good. And then it blunders directly into this, which... It's interesting that you don't even need to take the rook. And then I'm really happy I found the brilliant move. Queen trade makes sense after 93. And then here I allowed this, but endgames are so difficult, it's very hard. Yeah, the rest is easy. So that was another good game. We only got 5 points for it though, which is kind of crazy, because if I mess up even like, if I don't focus for even a second, I allow things like e5, and then I just lose all my rating points, even though he didn't see it, and it wasn't bad. But if I beat a 1900, I only have 5 points. Man. 90% accuracy. Yeah, e5. Either way. Good game. We keep it going. I rarely face the Sicilian at the lower ratings, so I don't get a lot of play with it, a lot of experience. I have almost none. So I need, from the white side, I need to get some more Sicilian games in, but I can't force my opponents to play it. Either way, that was a good, fun game. We keep on climbing. 2100. Interspersed throughout the speedrun. Good luck in your chess. Submit your games in my Discord. Goodbye.